July has been a month full of surprises for moviegoers. Some films that might normally have gone unnoticed have become massive successes, while other films that should be talked about by everyone have been almost completely overlooked. Some films, which I'll talk about in another video, lulled audiences into a false sense of security before overwhelming them with messaging to provoke strong emotional reactions, while some films underwhelmed, falling completely flat, void of emotional connection, and collapsing under the weight of their own expectations. Oppenheimer is a film that I really wanted to like, looking forward to it ever since the first teaser trailer released over a year ago. It's a film that has just about everything going for it: an incredible cast of talented actors, a master cinematographer behind the camera, and one of the most acclaimed and talked about directors of the modern day. And yet, Oppenheimer just may be the biggest disappointment of the year. First, let's talk about the narrative structure of the film. In the simplest terms, it's a mess. Like all great directors, Christopher Nolan has his set of trademarks, and the most prominent of these is how he structures his stories. He favors non-linear narratives, meaning that instead of a nice, succinct beginning, middle, and end, his stories follow a different pattern. Like in Memento, starting at the end, flashing back to the beginning, and then finally working its way towards the middle. In his previous films, this non-linear structure has always served to enhance the films, taking typical stories and elevating them with a fresh perspective, but always keeping a through line of sorts in his structure, progressing the overall story forward even if the time and scenes jump around. In Oppenheimer, however, there was no through line, no event tying everything together, and the non-linear story really doesn't serve a purpose other than to just confuse the audience, a confusion further enhanced by the occasional use of black and white photography, which Chris Nolan had stated was to separate the more objective, factual scenes from the more subjective and less factual scenes. It's an interesting idea, but it simply wasn't implemented well enough, giving no new perspectives when the scenes were then played again in color when previously shown in black and white, and only enhanced the disconnect felt by an audience being pulled from one time period to the next with no real story-driven reason as to why, other than because the director likes telling stories that way. It makes for an unbelievably jarring experience, and it just feels like a cheap gimmick in its application here, almost as if a self-parody of his previous works. That brings me along to the overall tone of the film, which seems to be as confused as the audience watching it. Oppenheimer doesn't really know what kind of film it wants to be. Is it a character piece focused on the human drama and personal life of Robert Oppenheimer? Is it a sprawling epic about one man's part in a destructive force, a sort of modern version of Bridge on the River Kwai? Is it a political thriller? Is it a psychological piece about how the ramifications of Oppenheimer's actions tortured him and fractured his psyche? The film itself doesn't know, and it tries to be all of these things at once, and as a result, succeeds in being none of them. As an audience, we can't really invest in any one aspect of this film or another, as each is rushed out of the way to make room for the next. His personal relationships presented are weightless, and we aren't given enough space to care about them as the film hyperactively jumps back in time to something else, be it the political investigations or the making of the bomb or Oppenheimer's hallucinations. His personal demons don't haunt the audience either in the way the filmmakers perhaps would have wanted, as like the character-driven aspects, we aren't given the time to let them sink in with the audience before changing genres again. Lastly, let's talk about the visuals. With credits like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Spectre, and Interstellar, just to name a few, it goes without saying that Hoyte van Hoytema has proved his mastery of light and composition time and time again. However, with Oppenheimer, a lot is left to be desired. The Trinity test scene is incredible to see, and it captures the tension, the awe, and even the horror of the moment. But beyond about 5 minutes of screen time, the rest of the 3 hours fails to justify its own existence or the use of the 65mm format, as it is simply visually unappealing. Whether it's scenes playing out in college lecture halls or small meeting spaces, the final images we see on screen, while well thought out, are decidedly uncinematic. like in the courtroom scene, which are some of the best looking moments outside of the Trinity test. They end up coming across as flat and mundane out of a desire for maximum authenticity. Hoyte van Hoytema placed his lighting outside the windows and supplemented nothing on the interior, foregoing a more cinematic look in favor of a completely authentic look. And while pure authenticity is great and something that I think more cinematographers should strive for, it doesn't always make for the most visually compelling shots. And it begs a question for this film why 65mm IMAX cameras were needed outside of a tiny, tiny portion of the movie. What's also interesting in regard to the shot composition is his framing, specifically the height of the camera. Oppenheimer as a character in the film is unbelievably hard to connect to, and that's not because of a lack of a great performance from Cillian Murphy or because of an uninteresting story, but perhaps mostly because of the positioning of the camera, which rarely incorporates framing that takes Oppenheimer's subjective position, framing him almost always either above or below his eye level. Most often during the film, the camera is kept further away from Oppenheimer, and not at his subjective angle, but at an angle of the characters that he interacts with, which might be an interesting move if there is consistency in it. Like if this film had started that way, keeping Oppenheimer at a bit of a distance, using longer lenses, they used 50 to 80 millimeters only, and gradually moving it closer and with that shorter lens as the film went on, bringing the camera closer to his eye level so that we as the audience begin to empathize more and more with him. However, this technique was implemented completely at random, taking his subjective position on select certain scenes, often ones that had very little to no bearing on the events in his life, and would then switch out randomly. The one character who did seem to have the most consistency with this, though, was Robert Downey Jr.'s Louis Strauss, which is strange since he in no small way is portrayed as the villain of the film, or at the very least, the antagonist. The very slice-of-life, almost documentarian approach to lighting design, coupled with a disconnect in framing of the lead character, resulted in a film that is simply not worth the higher price tag of an IMAX screening. To sum up, this movie was just a letdown. It's a kind of film you'll probably see once and then never watch again, which is a shame because despite the failings of this film, it was clearly made by a lot of incredibly talented people, and their efforts are on full display. But unfortunately, when it comes to cinema, that simply isn't enough. Well, all my film nerds, that's all there is for today. Remember to keep your lighting soft, your focus sharp, and I'll see you next time.
I don't know if we can be trusted with such a weapon.